Welcome to the last of our technical panels on evolving XBRL, and let me run through the group of esteemed panelists. Mark Goodhand is the chairman of the XBRL, the base spec working group, where all of these kinds of issues eventually end up in one form or another. Walter Hamscher is known to us all for moving the SEC into the technical aspects of XBRL, and I would almost say the same for Hugh, moving the XII into the technical aspects of XBRL, and Victor moving Spain, and Formula.
Who are you moving?
I'm just moving the discussion along.
Okay.
We had a number of talking points that we could either choose to follow or choose to kind of randomly be directed by your interests and how the discussion moves. The first one was the issue of the IEEE 754. I actually purchased the standard so we can read it. And as we started to cut and paste the standard into the emails of the base spec working group, I think it had an immediate effect that there's things in there that we do need to pay attention to. And on the European side of things, Victor has spearheaded and maintained a steady discussion of the issues of what do we do about precision, which to me is the same subject because the IEEE standard governs what people put on the chips that are in your PCs. Other topics we probably should address. HTML5 is coming around the corner. Inline XBRL is stuck with what it had when the standard was being written. We need to discuss whether and how that might possibly impact each other. There's a new XSD standard. At the time that we wrote this outline, XSD 1.1 did include precision decimal. Since then, there's this little note in the new CR 3 or 4 or something of XSD 1.1 that, oh golly gee, nobody cares about precision, so maybe we'll drop it. And I think that's more of an issue of, oh golly gee, XII has to talk to W3C so that people know we do exist. There's an Xlink 1.1, and then finally there's an Xpath 3, so let's start with precision. And up to you guys, I don't know, it's either a Victor or a Mark. Which one of you would like to? The mic's next to Mark.
Right.
And then Victor gets this mic.
So some of you who've been following the proposed edited recommendations for the base 2.1 spec will have seen that we've moved away from precision and to decimals as a way of doing our calculations for the sake of summation item. It was motivated by edge cases that just don't work at all with precision, notably precision 0. But as part of reworking it, we came to re-examine the language around rounding and discovered that we were being a bit inconsistent. So what we've decided is that we're actually going to standardize, rather than reinventing the wheel and trying to make sure that we get our definition right in the spec, we're just going to do the sensible thing and reference this IEEE standard that somebody found, and Herm bought.
We actually reference it in the base spec at the very end.
Yeah.
Nobody bothered to buy it, though.
Originally, yes. So well done, Herm.
It costs about 5 beers.
Yeah. I think originally it just dealt with floating point, but it now covers, in its 2008 update, it covers decimal as well, so that's what we need it for.
The 2008 update is actually worded that in 2008 the standard was changed to accommodate the needs of the financial reporting community. And of course none of us knew it. But that's our words.
Yeah, so that's why we're actually now looking at round to even, which is apparently what bankers like. I don't know if anyone has thoughts or comments or questions about any of that.
regarding precision, the problem in the end that we have is when it comes to validate data, we have to consider that the data that is sent is not totally accurate, at least in most of the cases. As the data in the end passes through physical storage, in the end you are using systems that are limited to a certain degree of the accuracy of the data. As a consequence, when you apply a validation on the data that you are gathering, it is possible that you will raise errors that are not errors. Well, they're errors technically, but they're the consequence of the accumulation of those rounding errors of the data that you are receiving. And if this is the case, the problem is that you won't be able to make the difference at least easily, or at least not spending a lot of time and making a big effort to make the difference between what is a real error because the meaning of the concepts that you are representing in a taxonomy has not been understood by the filer, or an error because of just a slight deviation caused by these roundings. So in the calculation link base, there was a very simple approach which didn't work. And in the formula specification, let's say there is a very simple approach as well that work if you, as author of the taxonomy, do the work. So that it means that when you define a formula, you have to take care of those thresholds. What's the problem? We were discussing before about making technology for the users. It's not about technology by itself, but technology to have a benefit. And well, in the end, there are standards like the IEEE, IEEE. There are also some mathematical approach to deal with these rounding errors in a more sophisticated manner. And not putting the problem, not putting the responsibility of dealing with that at the taxonomy author level. So this is one of the issues that it could be interesting, and it is somehow related also with XML schema 1.1 and with Xpath 3, because well, the idea is that we are using Xpath, we are using XML schema in our specification, and it could be quite interesting that from a user point of view, you just define a very simple validation, and and the work of taking care of rounding errors will be done by the technology itself. So this is something that we have to take care of and see how can we provide a solution for this.
Thank you. I'm going to throw out a radical idea, which is based upon the fact that a lot of this discussion derives from the fact that we've got this rounding and precision decimal, which really only in the base spec really is only affected by the calculation link base, and and as has been said before, both here in this session and in earlier sessions, calculation link base essentially is broken. It performs a very trivial function compared with what the formula spec does, and it doesn't actually affect validation in XBRL terms, because even if an instance doesn't conform to, or even if the sums of items in an instance don't add up, all that is essentially a warning. It doesn't invalidate the instance itself. So one way for us to sidestep this issue would actually be to deprecate the calculation link base altogether.
I forgot my disclaimer. Sorry.
Yeah, there certainly is a case to be made there. I don't think we've ever yet, well, we've deprecated some minor things in errata releases of the 2.1 spec, adding some shoulds about things you shouldn't do. So we could add similar warnings to summation item. I think there are still cases, despite its limitations, notably its inability to do cross-context calculations. It is still a more convenient way of arranging a hierarchy of summations rather than creating all of those corresponding XBRL formulas. So another thing that might be worth considering is something that preserves that hierarchy but operates on it using, say, something like XBRL formula or Sphinx or whatever language you like. It reads that hierarchy and then performs more sensible calculations than we get with summation item. Because it's nicely declarative and transparent to the user how things add up, roll up, as accountants say, with summation item. So I think there's a place for something like it. It's just a shame we got the details wrong. Walter?
Honestly, I don't have anything to say on this subject. I really don't.
In your stead, I will make the observation that the calculation link bases submitted to the SEC are not validated by the SEC, although there are outside websites that you all look at that put little red stars and green stars based on what they see in the calculation link base, obviously ignoring the edge case of 0 not being admissible according to the current spec. With the thought that we would transition to the use of formula. In formula, we perform arithmetic currently by whatever the hardware performs arithmetic that is implemented in Xpath expressions. And if the arithmetic that's implemented in the floating point hardware that the IEEE thinks that financial people should be using has this ability in every arithmetic expression to propagate the rounding and to perform the rounding as part of what the CPU does, as opposed to having to write software and if, then, else, and all that kind of stuff. That's not accessible. The CPU stuff is not yet accessible to what we code in XPath to expressions, and in fact, it's not accessible to XSD 1.0 because there's no data type for it. I think there's this general issue of, do we need to become more aware of these other standards and assert our ability to use that if this would come in? And I know Victor has talked a lot about, should we build special functions in the XPath 2 environment so that arithmetic expressions could be rounded as you go? Or should we try to push the process to use what the underlying standard has and have it built in and as intrinsics and then need a newer version? Up for grabs, and who wants that?
Well, the first thing to say is that with the current status of the formula specification, it is possible to implement this kind of functions. However, this has a small problem, is that in XPath, operators are not cannot be overloaded. I'll try to translate that to English. That means that let's say that I have a operation something like A equal B plus C. The way to express that in XPath is just like that: A equal B plus C. So it's something quite useful, quite clear for the user. If we wanted to perform that operation using this kind of functions, that expression would be replaced by something like function equal brackets, and with two different arguments. So that would be A, and the other argument would be another function whose arguments are B and C, which, well, it's a sort of an infix, prefix notation, or augmentation, or well, actually, for some of us, it's not so ugly. Actually, it's called Polish notation. Well,
The room is full of Polish people.
and they're nice guys. So the idea is that it will be quite interesting to take advantage of the existing standards and doing so in an easy way for the user. So definitely, I think we have to to maintain a more intense relationship with other standardization bodies and had some big feedback to them.
Thank you. How do we do that?
Well, I'm not going to answer that question directly, but I'm going to share another thought, because the whole idea of making use of underlying standards, which XBRL is built on underlying standards, but of course the specs as recommended by XII are built on underlying standards that were in existence at the time that those specs were recommended. Now, if we look at spec 2.1, that was December the 31st, 2003. The world has actually moved on since then in terms of some of the underlying specifications, and you've got some of them listed here. Xlink 1.1 is now a recommendation of W3C. We're fortunate that, in fact, we reviewed Xlink 1.1 and determined that it actually didn't make any difference. So that one is sort of off the table to a large extent, unless somebody wishes to dispute that assertion. XSD 1.1, which is still not a recommendation from the W3C, when that becomes a recommendation, that does really raise a big issue for XBRL International, because there are a lot of functions and features in XSD 1.1 that, had that been in existence at the time that we built the original spec, we could have taken significant advantage of. Co-occurrence constraints, yep, for example. Mark's probably closer to it than I am, but...
Yeah, I mean, so as someone who's done a lot of XML as well as XBRL, I think XSD 1.1 does have a lot of interesting stuff. The assertions are Xpath 2 rather than Xpath 1. It makes it very easy to create open content models. As for the co-occurrence constraints and the content models, relating back to a discussion we were having earlier, I'd actually like to see less complex content in XBRL. So those particular features I wouldn't be so keen that we move to take advantage of. But the precision decimal data type that relates to the IEEE and sort of builds in the notion of precision and decimals, which currently are separate attributes, that does have a certain appeal. I suppose what I'd say is, yes, in answer to your question, Herm, we definitely should be keeping an eye on these standards and looking at what's in the pipeline. And there may come a point where there's a killer feature there that we want to take advantage of. My feeling at the moment is that the things that are holding XBRL back are not related to minor technical deficiencies that we'd address by upgrading our specs that we depend on.
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, there's a huge inherent danger in going down that road, which is what has held us back up till now, and that is that as soon as you start to talk about changing the specification, there are a lot of people out there that get really, really scared. Yeah. And they say, oh my God, you know, we've just got our hands around, you know, our brains around this specification, and now you're talking about changing it. What is not commonly understood is that time frames to implement those sorts of dramatic changes are very, very long. If you look at XSD 1.1 itself, the W3C still has not taken that all the way to recommendation. And I think that particular spec has probably been going through the process for 7 years now, something like that.
Yeah,
so,
it's been going quite a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, Schema 1.0 was actually relatively new when we adopted it for XBRL, and we did suffer initially because some of the implementers of the schema libraries hadn't got things like substitution groups working quite properly.
Including some of very major ones.
Yeah, which is, so we not only used schema, but we relied on some of the more esoteric features that not everyone had got quite right by that point. So when 1.1 does go to rec, I think we'll want to give it a couple of years for things like Xerces and .NET, MSXML, whatever, to really make sure they've properly implemented
it. I wanted to steer a slightly different twist to that, which is if 1.1 is, for example, uncertain whether anybody cares about precision decimal, perhaps we have some sort of a maybe a moral obligation to at least provide feedback and make our view of these issues known, totally independent of whether we might use it, you know, now or in 30 million years.
Yeah, I certainly agree. I think we should definitely say that we do care, that we are interested in it. The W3C has a very interesting working group note on the topic. It's not just simply some esoteric spec in esoteric wording in the draft spec itself. I only discovered the working group note yesterday, so I haven't had a chance to read it in detail, but it looks pretty good and comprehensive, and there's certainly a lot of learning we can take from that, so I think we should be providing feedback on that.
Yeah, and obviously now when it's pre-rec is the time for us to get our feedback in.
Exactly.
So how do we do that in XII?
Well, you have the chair of the specification working group, on behalf of the specification working group, send an email to the through the official comment channels at W3C, which is open to the public because these are public documents. And I think their channels are actually, they have a mailing list that you actually have to subscribe to and send to. I think that's the way they deal with that.
Yeah, I take it XII they're not a member or are a member of W3C?
Yeah, there's all kinds of organizational and funding issues to for the consortium itself to be a member of the W3C. And when a body like XBRL International becomes a member of the W3C, it's only staff members of that organization that are actually allowed to participate in working groups. So what it really relies upon is employees of organizations who are also members of the W3C, who are members of XBRL International and members of the W3C. Employees of those organizations can participate in W3C working groups. Otherwise, you're restricted to the public feedback mechanisms that the W3C have in place, which are paralleled, incidentally, by XBRL International's public feedback mechanisms.
So once we have some feedback, we'll get the bureaucracies talking to each other, and there we go. Yeah.
Kind of stretching the W3C before we get on to inline and HTML. XPath in 2.0 has provoked a moderate amount of feedback to formula people on why did you use XQuery, or what made you do this or that. XPath 3, which is again in that review stage and proposed features stage, XPath 3 has a number of features. One of them is what the XQuery calls flower, the for-let with blah blah blah. I don't remember it, but you can have assignment statements, let statements, which seem that they would be terribly useful in making the custom function implementation dramatically simpler and more straightforward. And a number of additional things. Victor, you've talked about that before. What's your thoughts on XPath 3 as something with or without the precision stuff that would be useful to us?
Besides the precision stuff, I think that they had this kind of lambda functions definitions, yes, which well, this is a concept. It's a concept of functional programming, which is quite useful in order to provide very clean implementation of some maybe more complex operations that we could face when we are making a formula or a validation. Another interesting feature, which is related to this idea for the overloading operators, is how do we deal with units? In the end, in XPath, we are dealing with numeric values. But in XBRL, we don't have numeric values. We have numeric values with a precision and with a unit. So it could be quite interesting if we could take advantage of that, for instance, in order to, given a formula, having automatically calculated the output unit of that formula, given the operation that we have. Or even more, let's imagine that we provide a validation in terms of, say, that this concept must be equal to this plus this. If they were in a different unit, maybe we will be able to provide some kind of automatic, applying automatically an exchange rate provided in some sort of mechanism. So there are some things that for the future we should consider in order to make the language more powerful and simpler to use as well.
Any audience feedback before we switch to HTML? Maybe to switch to HTML, that would impact inline XBRL. I'm wondering, we have both Andy and Walter here, only for asking about personal opinions, of course. Andy, you're involved with probably the largest by volume usage of inline XBRL in a prior form of HTML. How do you see an impact or a transition, or would there ever be one, or your thoughts? And turn slightly so the camera can see.
Right. Okay. So forgive me for not being completely up to speed with HTML5, but is it well formed? Is it
No.
intended? It's not. No.
Yeah.
So
That's,
that's the biggest problem for HMRC and the Corporation Tax Service, I think, is that we have a constraint that the transactions that pass through the UK government gateway before they even get to HMRC have to be well-formed XML, which is why we required XHTML for our service. So HTML5 does present a bit of a problem in that situation, which means that migration forward to HTML5 from where we are might be a problem.
Yeah. I think there is actually an XHTML5 version of it.
Okay. Well, in that case, it may not be such an issue.
Yeah.
I mean, HTML5, as I understand it, has a lot richer set of elements. But to be honest, the sorts of documents we're talking about potentially here are fairly boring, straightforward documents that probably don't use any of the esoteric things, certainly not any multimedia. So I suspect the impact on producers and on the content and on the capabilities is going to be pretty minor. So migration forward on that basis, assuming there's a well-formed variant, shouldn't, I would imagine, be too much of an issue. But I suspect in other situations it may be more of a problem.
What about this side of the pond?
I think we're in a very unusual situation in that case, because Edgar accepts HTML, which is manifestly not well formed. Meta tags and other things right there. You can't get nearly 100 characters into it without finding that it's not well formed. And so when the inline XBRL specification was written, it was my understanding that it was written in such a way that there was one preferred embedding, which was XHTML, but it was not designed in such a way that it couldn't be embedded in other languages. I believe PDF actually got kicked around at one point. I mean, you know what I mean. I mean, considered. It might have been kicked around too. SVG, I suppose, was there was some notion that you might be able to create a graph and have anyway, was not the only language. So at the time, I sort of held out the hope that you could still embed it into HTML. Now, here's the thing that strikes me about that conversation just now. We sort of said, oh well, there's an XHTML version of HTML5, and wouldn't it be nice if XBRL had versions that sort of had different serialization syntaxes to meet different needs? HTML5, presumably the reason it's not well formed is because they want to accommodate people who are still writing tag soup in in Notepad and don't necessarily need to be able to create well formed stuff, maybe compactness issues and so on. But one of the things that it would be nice to consider before considering what new standards we base things on, step back and say, is there, with all we have learned, an alternative serialization of what you might consider to be an XBRL document object model sort of equivalent? In other words, is there some abstraction not very far above our current syntax, because I often find that we are very, very constrained by our syntax. So, for example, you try and there are plenty of cases where you'd like to be able to fix the context ref to a known value because it just doesn't matter within a particular document. And you can't do that because the schema was written a certain way. Yeah, it's true.
You can't fix it like decimals? You
No,
can
there's
fix
some
decimals.
there's some particle attribution blah kind of problem. But maybe that's not the best example. My point here is that there are lots of details.
We could do a PER on that, right?
PER?
Proposed edited recommendation. Less serious than switching to inferring decimals.
You should not take what I said as volunteering to do that. I was really more... I know you're always eager for new things to do. But no, my point is that if we actually... I think there's a lesson there in the W3C. Having two versions of what fundamentally is their specification is not nearly as tied to the surface level syntax, and that's a big advantage for them. Even though they're sort of the kings of surface level syntax, they took this thing, which was a really important standard with millions and millions of websites, and felt perfectly comfortable having two serialization syntaxes for it. There are lots of things about the serialization of XBRL that I think you could change without doing any real damage to interoperability. You just have two different ways of actually parsing into a common object model.
So I'm seeing two threads
Yeah,
coming from this discussion.
You
One
saw
being,
what I did there, right? Yeah.
One being this fork, which I think is terribly interesting, onto alternative serializations, and hold that thread, because I think Eric in particular has at least had some humongous instance documents where if the serialization were twisted ever so slightly to be more efficient, it would be a great help. But there's the other side to that. You're talking about embedding this HTML, but the inline is doing the converse. It's embedding the instance document inside of the HTML. If the inline XBRL became usable through whatever processes or political or bureaucratic things that might happen in the future, would that inline XBRL, if we used it on this side of the pond, be useful to have more of the HTML5 or evolving features? And then we've got that other thread to go to, which is very interesting on improving the serialization that we have currently. So first back to, if we use the inline where the outside is the HTML and the embedded part is the XBRL.
No, I understand what you're trying to get me to go to, and I'm not going to go there because we've made as I was just talking about, the cost and effort of changing anything that goes on in the XBRL piece of Edgar is so substantial that, given that we actually have some momentum around one way of doing it, I'm not keen to start talking about yet another way of doing it. It would be much better if Edgar would change from its HTML 3.2 plus Edgar specific stuff to a well-formed XHTML, and that's actually something that there are people who understand that would have a number of advantages, having nothing to do with inline XBRL. Nothing. Doesn't have to do with the HTML. Yeah, it has to do with the HTML piece of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I should just mention that this whole question of inline XBRL and HTML5 was actually raised some time ago by Charlie Hoffman, who sent out a couple of emails asking this question. And I recall having asked Philip Allen, who was really one of the key architects of inline XBRL, about this. Unfortunately, I can't recall exactly what his answer was, but there are people from his organization here who might. But his answer, in a nutshell, was there are significant architectural issues with doing that, but I can't remember what they were.
Yeah, I think it's just that he's devoted enough of his life already to inline XBRL, and he doesn't fancy doing some more work on it imminently. I mean, the other thing is that, as Andy was saying, those really exciting features of HTML5, the video, the canvas, the audio, the geolocation, the offline operation, none of them really benefit a financial report. So we've got something that's simple, that works. Why not just run with it for a while?
Agree.
Yesterday I heard a talk about reviewing GRI reports on your iPhone, and
Sounds good. I seem to remember reading about HTML5 a feature called Microdata.
Yeah, which is, I think, a formalization of microformats.
Microformats, and that's where inline XBRL started, of course,
Yeah.
as a microformat. So there might be some scope to go back and see whether inline XBRL could be reformulated as an HTML5 microdata format. That might be the way forward ultimately.
Yeah, and I think there was actually some discussion of that on the list. Somebody did raise it. I think HTML5 is quite loosely defined, but microdata is certainly one of the ideas associated with it, and I think there's some API support for microdata. As Andy said, we did actually start off, I don't know whether the website's still there, but we created this site called Micro XBRL when we were first prototyping stuff to meet HMRC's requirements. And the irony of it was that the micro format wasn't so micro, with all these nested spans to capture all the information. You actually end up with something that's quite verbose and not very readable. If you do, as we tended to do then, a view selection source in Firefox or Safari to see what's underneath it. So the approach we ended up going with was inline XBRL, which is similar to the embedding of MathML or SVG in HTML, which other people had already done. If we were doing it today, I think we probably would take a close look at microdata in HTML5. It's, as Hugh was saying, you work with the standards that are around and mature at the time when you're setting off on your piece of standards work. Not to say we can't revisit in the future.
Sure. Just as a comment on HTML5 in general, I don't believe that just my own experience with, and I've spent some time looking into HTML5, by design, of course, it's really something that's supposed to be backwards compatible. In other words, you can completely ignore HTML5 and it'll have no impact on you whether, whatever browser you're using. So I would imagine, just based on that any impact it would have on inline XBRL would certainly be positive and in no way, shape, or form have a negative impact because of that design philosophy.
I think the only resistance to it, and Walter is right, that the idea of multiple embedding formats was discussed at the time, and we were keen to have it possible to embed it in ordinary HTML as well as XHTML, and that would, of course, scale forward gracefully to HTML5 for the reasons you say. There's a distinction in the inline XBRL spec between a conformant processor and a validating conformant processor. And the validation side of it is quite important to people like HMRC. Currently, we only have schemas available for XHTML, using obviously well-formed XML as a starting point, and then applying schemas to it as well to enforce certain constraints. That's not to say that a different profile couldn't be worked out for HTML 3.2/4/5, what have you.
Any more comments on HTML before we take the other fork in the road? So the other fork in the road is alternate serializations. Everybody has noticed that there are 30 megabytes of disk files, PK zip down to 1/4 meg. Eric, I think your project has some of the largest instance documents. You have any comments on what this might mean to have an alternative serialization?
Yes, we have big instances and we have big names for the elements. So we have some problems. So we will switch to codes, like we follow EBA and EIOPA will also use code. And I think that Herm is speaking about syntax. We have an XML with a different syntax. We are using indentation instead of begin and end tag. That helps a little. I think you discussed about that. But it's still XML. It's another way to show XML. For example, you have you have the tag A, so we put A, and then you indent a little. We type B, and then you have a B, B below the A, and then you type equal something, and then you have the value of B. But it's still another syntax for XML, but it's still XML. But it helps a little because we don't have, we no longer have end tags. And it's easy to write it with a Notepad or a Palm, having well-formed instances. So we switch back and forth between this syntax and the XML, real XML syntax. But
it's XML and Python.
Yes, it's using indentation for nesting of elements.
Sounds interesting. So we at CoreFiling actually did, I think it was a couple of years ago, I did a blog post on what we call Composite XBRL, which was the idea of taking an instance document plus its DTS, slapping it together in a single document. XBRL is quite verbose, although it compresses nicely. But it's one thing that is not very easy to work with is traditional XML tools. So because it takes away all of the hierarchy that things like Xpath operate on so nicely, you end up having to use extension functions or other mechanisms to navigate your way around. So I think there is a place for people transforming XBRL, perhaps receive it at the gateway, transform it into a format that works better internally for their system. And you can take that hit up front in one place. All of your XBRL processing is localized, and thereafter you just operate on ordinary XML. And there are some examples of that format. But the idea basically is save people the pain of DTS discovery, bring it all together, take these graph structures that you have in Xlink defining all the hierarchies and turn them into ordinary XML hierarchies, and apply a bit of structure to the instance document, which is normally completely flat except for tuples, and instead just do some simple clustering so that things in exactly the same context and unit appear under a common parent element. And once you've done those simple steps, you've then got something that you can work with in Schematron and Xpath, XLT, all these traditional things, and even I think HMRC have some hardware XLT or crazy things like that. So you have these mature technologies that have existed for a while, but you can't very well go and push an extension, an XPath extension function into these things. So I think there is value in that. It's the sort of thing I can imagine people getting a bit nervous about if we were to discuss it broadly, the idea of alternative syntaxes for the core XBRL itself. Probably since we've got this standard out there and it's gained a lot of adoption, we're best keeping that as the wire format that we use for Exchange. But I think there is potentially use internally, as I said, and also for XBRL formula. When you mentioned alternative syntaxes at the W3C, Walter, the first thing I thought of was XQueryX, which is something that nobody ever uses, but it's it's an XML syntax for XQuery. So, you know, XLT is always XML, but XQuery, they give you two syntaxes. Guess which one people tend to use? It's the non-XML syntax, because that's easier for humans to work with. You could imagine a non-XML, or non-Xlink, non-XML syntax that has the same semantic model as XBRL formula, and that again would be a lot easier for humans to work with.
I would say that from the format of the taxonomy files point of view is not so important. You know, as far as there is a clear model on top of that, and we have tools that are able to work on that model, which is actually one of the initiatives that we have. It doesn't matter the format in the end. For instance, whether we use Xlink, Xlink 1.1, or RDF triplets is the name for the. I mean, in the end, the important is the target that we pursue. If we are able to represent that information in that syntax, then it's not important. However, I think that the issue that Walter has raised about a different format for the representation of instance documents, it is an important thing, because actually I'm aware of some projects that were considering XBRL to deal with credit register information, which is a lot of information, and discarded that because of the volume of information and difficulties that we have in XML to process an instance file. Because, well, for those of you that are not aware, the problem that we have in an instance file is that in order to read datum, we might be forced to read the whole document because the context could be the last element in the file, and the element itself could be the first one. So I think that there's a lot of place to have a different serialization format. I don't think that will be a big fuss. Actually, inline XBRL is a different way to represent an instance file, and it's working there. And as far as I know, there hasn't been any complaints or bad reactions from the market. So maybe this is something that we should consider eventually.
I guess I just want to draw one last analogy there, if you will. Hang on, it's a bit abstract, but as we all know, back in the 90s, there was a number of SGML applications, and at some point, somebody decided that, and I don't remember who it was, decided that it was a little too complicated. Let's simplify it. Let's call it, let's make it web accessible. Let's call it XML, so that we don't, we can't have optional tags, and originally they weren't even going to have attributes, and so it was a real simplification of it. But they could sort of argue that, well, anything you can do there, you can actually do in this simplified syntax. All right. Are we at that point now with XBRL where you say, okay, we've got this very complex syntax, hard to deal with, you kind of got to go get proprietary applications that can parse. Is it time now to think about saying, good model, and as you know, XML is an SGML, right? It's not like it's got you can describe it with an SGML DTD and all that. So is it time now to actually step back and say, hey, is there a better wire format for what we now have and understand to be taxonomies, generic links, formulas, basically sort of bundle it all up and say, maybe there's a better wire format here that would have the properties that Victor points out. There are some hierarchies that are a lot more important than others in XBRL, and yet we represent all of them using link bases. So it's just a thought there that there's actually precedent for this kind of big move, and it can have very beneficial effects.
Yeah, and then this is actually one of the visions that has been articulated of some of the what could result from the abstract modeling exercise.
That's true. That's true. I forgot about that. Yes.
What if that alternative format were in the form of star or snowflake schemas that maybe are very close to the abstract model, but they are in SQL? You might have to use MySQL or Postgres instead of a flat text file. Why would that be different? Wouldn't that work?
Are you talking about just for formulas, or?
No. At least for the instance document, and maybe for more.
How about something like JSON, right? It's fairly compact, and it would work better in a browser.
I don't know.
JSON has the same problem. You'd have the same problem with JSON as you would have with XML. And as the gentleman pointed out, you'd have to consume the entire JSON representation to get to any part of it. So
fair enough. Tongue was planted firmly in cheek there. But my point, the analogy I'm trying to draw here is that SGML had a penetration, it had a user base, and in order to get to the next level of breadth of adoption, they actually had to make a sacrifice. It was probably quite controversial at the time.
Yeah, I'm just...
There were probably some very unhappy SGML vendors and SGML people.
I'm just thinking the morning's discussion of the analytics. We're all on the push side, one at a time, sending something in, and the people who are going to use this stuff are all on the pull side, and they would like to have the the large quantity of stuff analyzable by tools. And Maciek is smiling away. All those tools need databases, so why don't we just start with them on the push side? And what if we started with them on the push side with exactly the abstract model that we have now?
So I'm going to say a couple of things that might get people scared, but we're already straight into this territory. The two things are XBRL 2.2 and XBRL 3.0. You can imagine something like XBRL 2.2 would just be an update very similar to XBRL 2.1 that maybe tidies up the language, gets rid of some of the things we don't use, and updates the versions of the specifications it references, keeping the same general model. And what we've just strayed into now is a discussion of much more fundamental changes to the syntax of XBRL, possibly retaining much of the same model. XBRL is certainly not an optimal format for all use cases. As Victor was saying, if you want to do stream-based processing, you want the reference to precede the references so that you can just process all of the context, say, and then be done with them and know you can move on. And I think that adding a bit more structure into it, XML-wise, as I was saying a minute ago, could actually help as well. So it's easy to conceive of these improvements, where I'm not sure, I suppose I'm saying I'm not sure we're there yet, in that, coming back to what I said at the beginning, the problems that XBRL is facing today in adoption and the challenges that people are having in consuming XBRL, they're largely not down to these sort of issues. For certain specialized cases with very large documents, yes, you may be running into trouble, and perhaps XBRL isn't the thing to use, or maybe you should have an alternative format for that use case, which then maps to XBRL or to an XBRL taxonomy. But for most people, for all its warts, XBRL actually does work, it does the job, and the challenges are largely not related to the syntax, because we now have quite mature libraries out there, like our own True North. Various competitors of ours have libraries that hide the complexity, the syntax complexity, to a greater or lesser extent, so that people can get on with dealing with the semantics. So having said XBRL 2.2 and XBRL 3.0, I don't think we should be rushing towards either of those, but it is useful to have in the back of your mind the sort of ways you might change things when there actually is a pressing need to do that at some point in the future.
So when we go to the 3.0 or 7.0 and we have formula, which, although it's nicely abstracted and the processing model is perfect, it does have this piece called Xpath, which does mess around at the syntax level. So Victor, how do we make that leap? I mean, we turn formula processing into something based upon, as you nagged me the other day, based upon our model and not based upon our syntax, which it currently is.
Well, I guess that with a lot of effort.
But we have to replace Xpath.
Carefully and with
Yes, but well, in the end, one of the complaints that I have heard about XBRL is that the specifications were written in terms of the syntax rather than in the content. So now we have this initiative of the abstract model, which I think it is a very important thing, and we should all take good care of that. And there's another initiative, which is a revamping of the specifications. What that abstract model is clear, so that the specifications will be expressed in terms of that abstract model. So when we arrive to that point, we will be able to talk about ideas rather than syntax. And so in that moment, maybe taking advantage that everybody is looking at the abstract model, it is the right moment to change the syntax and go to something more efficient. But in the end, the interesting thing is that if we deal with the model, if we deal with the ideas rather than with the syntax, the impact in applications won't be important. We could consider different representations of the data as many other standards like ASN or others are using.
And I suppose I should jump in and mention Sphinx again. I don't know how many people attended the formula language deathmatch earlier. Apparently it ended up being quite civilized. But one of our concerns on why we didn't immediately rush to implement XBRL formula was that it is, through Xpath, tied very much to a syntax level view of things. And it works. You can use it to validate things, and it's a standard, and that's great. And for lots of use cases, that's the paramount concern. But if you step back and come at it from the approach of a business analyst who's wanting to write rules, they just don't want to think about any of that stuff. They want to operate on a logical model of the data, the semantics. And that's where Sphinx starts, and that's the sort of approach that I would expect a future version of XBRL formula to take, unless Sphinx takes over the world in the meantime.
Any more comments from the audience? If not, we're into the Union Hotel's cookie time. So I'd like to thank the panel.